Today we have Dr. Steve Weyhrich doing Bytes of History. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you all for coming today on this lovely morning. So this is about a little bit about Apple II history, focusing on magazines today. But history, what's it good for? I figure it's good because it tells us where we came from, where we are, where we're going. Some people who don't remember the Apple II forget this. That's about as much sound effects as we're going to get here. One thing I found interesting as I watched Jason Scott's two DVD documentaries, the BBS one and the Get Lamp one, is that they were exciting stories. It was fun to hear it, and the stuff is doing better, and they're making more things, and then it starts all failing and falling apart, and it's depressing at the end. And you know, but really, if you think about it, all history stories ultimately are rise and fall. You know, it happens with nations, it happens with computer companies and magazines and everything. And the same thing has to do with a lot of these magazines. Same thing has to do with all these magazines is that many of them started with big hopes and dreams. They did well, and you know, they had a risk in getting started. They hoped there'd be a reward involved in this, and sometimes there was adventure or even epic adventure as they went on the way. All the microcomputers had their rise and fall. Each of these things I'm showing here had its time in the sun, its rising, noontime, and fall. And documenting that is what's been interesting, but I guess I just have to get past the fact that they all had a fall. And even the ones that we're using today are going to have that fall eventually. There's not going to be a Macintosh someday. There's not going to be iPhones and iPods and Windows, and someday something else will take its place, hopefully better. But as I thought about this over the last few months, I came up with this concept of the lifespan of a computer. Or this goes with probably nearly any product out there, but I was thinking in terms of computers. And people said, what is with these crazy prices on eBay? You know, somebody sells an Apple, well, not eBay, but say Sotheby's in London sells an Apple I for $300,000, and on eBay there's another one for $18,000. And you used to be able to just pick up, if you're still lucky you still can, but you used to be able to pick up Apple IIs at a garage sale for nothing or at a Goodwill or something, and you want to buy them on eBay, and they're big bucks. Well, here's the deal. When something's new, here are the features of it. You got getting it at a list price. I mean, you're not going to get any special deals unless you know somebody at the company. People who get it often were people who wanted to know how to program it. They thought, oh, this is cool, I want this, or I want to start, you know, people who stood in line for the first iPhone, you know, they didn't know, they were the pioneers. You know, they got something that they paid a lot more money for than the people who came afterwards did. People got products created for any computer. The Apple II is a good example of that. And you get some small companies that get started. People said, hey, I can do something that other people like or find interesting. And those things expand the market. They make more people interested in buying the thing. So as it gets established, now the value is still probably the list price, but you might be able to get some better deals sometimes. You get some of the less skilled people joining in, people who really didn't, you know, the pioneers paved the way, they put the roads in, and now other people can follow along in their covered wagons and figure out what to do with that. The businesses that supported it are usually doing pretty well because there's people out there who, these new users, don't know what they're doing. They say, well, what am I going to do? And they say, I'll help you. There's a market that goes up, and as they learned over the years, the software sells the hardware, which sells more software. So, and at some point, you get large companies that get involved. They smell the money, and they say, well, it's time to get involved here. Now, as it gets older, now you got where you have falling prices. You might be able to get it for some bargain prices. Certainly some pioneers may be selling their things and moving on to something else. And you get the manufacturer abandoning it for the newer stuff. So we have Apple ultimately dropping the Apple II. Actually, abandon it long before they stop selling it, but that's another issue. And some people who really just want the next best, the latest, greatest things are going to move on. But the devoted people who can't let it out of their hands are going to hang on. That refers to a lot of us. The market for those products begins to shrink. And you see this through the years as you look at the magazines, that not only the market for the magazines shrink, but the market for the products the magazines were selling shrank, and that affected the magazines. The larger companies say, well, there's more money over here in the new thing, so that's where we're going to go now. And you have some point at which it simply becomes obsolete. The value is way down. They're not even servicing it anymore. People give it away, they throw it away. But again, the devoted people hang on to it. It has a place. Either it's hung on to because they love it, or because they don't even bother selling it, they just put it in a closet. And that happens. I still have 2 Newtons because I just didn't get around to selling them when I moved on from the Newton to something else. And I'm glad I have them now. But I regret selling my Apple IIc to get an Apple IIGS. I look back and say, I could have had my Apple IIc still. At the time, it's like I wasn't interested. I wanted the new thing because it was a better, faster, bigger capacity Apple II. And you have larger companies saying, oh, we're definitely not involved with that anymore. And smaller companies do it because they have a smaller market. Maybe they have a niche that they can fulfill. At some point, there's that transition line between becoming obsolete and becoming retro. And at the point where it becomes retro is where just lost my connection. At some point when it becomes retro, now it's old enough to be cool. And the value begins to go up again. We have something that's collectible. And I remember 10 years ago, you could get an Apple II for next to nothing on eBay. But now if you want to get an Apple II, not a 2 Plus, but an Apple II, typically they're going to go for big bucks on eBay if you have people find the thing and they start fighting over it, because there's not as many out there. Apple I's had not a big market, but they had several hundred out there, 200 at least. And a lot of them got pulled back into Apple as they tried to get people to upgrade to Apple IIs because there was less issue to support them. And of those people who either didn't hear the call or they just didn't want to do it, that's where the collectible ones today come from. So all the others just got destroyed. Lisa's, same thing. A bunch of them are in a landfill somewhere, but those that didn't get in the landfill have greater value today, especially if they work. So the value goes up, they're more scarce. They may not even function. And I'm not sure for the Apple IIs, that's a lot of the time that's not the case. I mean, I saw Tony trying out those computers upstairs when we first got here, and a lot of them still work. He had to do a little fiddling with the motherboards and jumping up and down on them, but they still work. And many people are going to say, that's part of my collection. And I got a collection at home now. I've had them on a shelf, and now we got this little shelf thing. I've got several things up there. That's my little tiny museum. And the nostalgia effect comes into play. All this has to do with lots of products. Apple II is one, but these magazines play a role like that too. I at one time said, gee, I'm carrying this around, all this SoftTalks. I'm not going to ever look at these again. I should just give them to somebody who wants them. And then a couple years later, I had that facepalm moment where I said, what did I do? And I found somebody I could buy some back from. Now, people who are still doing products for one of these retro computers are, I say they're doing it out of love, not for profit. Well, that's not entirely true. They do hope to at least make their money back on it, make a little bit on it. But they're not doing it because this is my livelihood now. They're often doing it as a sideline because they have some skill that they can use to make a product that the people who are using the retro computers can look and say, oh, I can use that. I mean, CFFA right there is an idea of something that nobody could have done 25 years ago. But it can be done today, and people say, this is fantastic, I want this. People are trying to preserve it, and we occasionally have the opportunists who say, whoa, I've got an old Apple II that was in grandpa's attic, it must be worth $10,000. And obviously that's not the case. So I was able to create with some difficulty this graph on Excel that shows the lifespan of the majority of computer magazines from the day. And some of these up here are not Apple specific, some of these down here are. We have one little bar here for one that's still hanging on, GS. So that's why I got to drag it in because I don't know when it's going to be done with. But there are some patterns along here. The pattern is not the color, that's just a nice rainbow thing. But there's some patterns along the way that we're going to look at during this. There was an era right around here, this is 84, where you had several of these early magazines fail. You got Micro, Softside, Apple Orchard Feelings 2, SoftTalk, all fell off. And that's because the market hit that point where the companies that were advertising smelled more dollars elsewhere, and they put their money in those other places. And that's about approximately, you see A+ starts here, and Insider starts here, and as that happened, these all died in 1884. There's some market issues that happened that year too. That was just after the video game crash. But all those things played a role. Now, some companies like Nibble, for example, where he didn't overextend himself, and he was somebody who knew the business to start with, he was able to keep it going much longer. Now, I could have been letting this scroll up here while I was talking. You can see this a little bit closer since that was such small type. Why do I want to talk about magazines now? It's mainly because I've just been doing some more research in the past year, getting more information learned, and I discovered some things about the magazines that I didn't know years ago when I first put this together. And I found some patterns as I did this. One of the patterns is we have some things that would be the general magazines, things that did not exclusively deal with the Apple, but they still had Apple articles. All of these up here had articles that dealt with the Apple, but they dealt with other computers too. And as the Apple II era was shrinking, these companies, particularly Bytes, they were moving on to other things that were more interesting to them. More dollars there, more revenue. You've got companies like this that did more of the, you would call it homebrew, but independent publishers who made a magazine like Call Apple and Apple Orchard have to do with user groups. We have Contact is actually not so independent, but it's a small thing coming out from Apple. But these are things where individuals have said, I'm going to make a magazine and publish it. And some of them, like the guy with Computers we'll get to later, didn't even worry about advertising because he knew he wasn't going to get much. Now we have the major publishers getting, they smell the money. So the major publishers get involved: Insider, A+, Redgate Publishing for Apple IIgs, Firesky, and ultimately Insider and A+ had to combine as the market began to condense a little bit. Now, we have some of, they're independent, but I call a little bit more newslettery things. Apple Assembly Line is an earlier one, but it was more of a newsletter. It wasn't really a full-fledged glossy magazine. Open Apple and A2 Central obviously were newsletters. AppleWorks Forum was always in a newsletter format. 2 Alive was, strictly speaking, a glossy magazine, but it was a smaller effort from a company, from a hardware software distribution company for the Apple II. Shareware Solutions and the Apple Blossom were clearly smaller efforts. JuiceGS started out as a small effort, and through the fact that he passed it on, instead of just saying, I can't do this anymore, shutting it down, he passed it on to other people who were interested and motivated, and they kept it going. And it is still going today. And then finally, we have disc publications, something that was brand new for the Apple II. Nobody ever come up with the idea of a way of having a magazine on a disc until SoftDisk came out with it. And then some others came up and did the same thing. And SoftDisk GS came in the picture too a little bit later. And finally, we have digital publications: Jeannie Lamp A2, A2 Pro, and then the Lamp ultimately. And those, again, were more small. They were definitely not large efforts, but I think these played a big role in terms of their influence, because not having the cost of printing and publishing, you could do a lot more. You could go farther with it, and it could be uploaded and shared everywhere easily. A magazine at that time, you still couldn't easily scan and then upload. Well, ultimately, I couldn't put everything, because my list would be like another 50% longer if I put all the small, really small niche publications in there. Even one of them I got there too, Computing, is so small. I put it in because somebody told me about it years ago, but I can't say I know a lot about it. What does this have to do with those magazines? I didn't even mention Popular Electronics. Well, I just want to point out that that's something that was influential in starting the revolution. I actually have this copy. This is mine from July '56, and this is not about computers, but notice that they're talking about it. It's in the press. Our electronic brains taking over. So even this one issue, this old issue I've got, which my dad had picked up sometime, and I had later on looked at for shortwave information, and they're talking about electronic brains back then. Radio electronics was one of the early influential ones because this is where you could buy a kit. Didn't sell a lot. People didn't complete it a lot because it was hard to do, but you could build the Mark 8, an 8008 based computer. That's not as capable as the 8080 that the Altair came from. But then you got, and somewhere here, there's a backwards order portion, but that's one I have too, because I was subscribing to it at the time in January of '75. Oh my gosh, you could build a computer. I had no money at the time, and it's probably a good thing I didn't, or I would have bought one of these things and suffered over trying to build it, because they weren't easy to do. But it was an exciting time to listen to what they were saying. They were talking about this. They had other articles later on here in November. They've got a 6800 computer that Altair came out with that you could build. They're having things like the Dazzler that you can use for graphics on this computer. It is 1976. Nobody's got graphics coming with these things natively yet. They've got a trainer like the Kim one. It's called the Cosmac Elf, and it uses a different processor. Again, something that if you're just dying to get into this, you want to learn programming, you want to build it, this is where you could get the information for it. Expanding the memory on it. And then July '77, the month of the Apple II, the month after the Apple II actually came out, we have finally, they're getting some graphics for the, instead of having to do things with switches on your thing or a teletype, now you actually have a screen and a video typewriter you can use for your Altair. Radio electronics here isn't even getting into the picture too, and they have it with this 8080 Micro, which is looking more like a trainer, but they had a kit that you could build for it too. So everybody's getting excited and involved with this. The number of articles on this shot up during that year around 74, 75, 76. But even before any computers came out, you had creative computing. Look at the date on this, if you can see from there. November, December '74. There's no micros on the market. There's nothing that you can buy. So this guy, he's focusing on computers and education. And you heard several people talking about, Randy Brandt, I think, did, and we had John Romero did, about how they had access to a computer through a dial-up with cards. I know at my high school, I didn't take the class, but they had some paper tape reading thing in the back of the room that you could use for doing programming. So here's how you use computers in school at that time. You could. This is going way farther forward. This is March of '84, but this is after the computers are well out there. And I like that picture because it just shows all of the computers, and here's some that are just kind of dying along the vine because they can't make it. Apple II's still there. He's busy. The IBM's in the front at that point. And of course, I like anniversary issues where they have historical information to give, so I kept those. Byte magazine was also important. And I like Byte because it had a lot of interesting articles, and even an article that wasn't about the Apple II could sometimes be used for information about it if they had a program listing. Basic was basic with extensions that you had to use to modify for your own. They had great covers, though. You know, this is about the home use of the domesticated computers. There it is down there. And this issue in '85 where they're reviewing the Lisa and the Apple IIe was pretty exciting. The electronic office before they had one. So this is December '83. We haven't got the Macintosh yet. We've got the Lisa came out, a month or two earlier, but they're saying, hey, here's what we could be doing sometime in the future. And although I don't have my windows all neatly arranged like this, mine all overlap. In fact, I just switched between them. But this is what we're doing today, and they were envisioning that back then. And the reason this one's important is not because of the medical professional stuff that's on there, but the fact this was made for, this is the issue where they discussed the Apple IIc. And then the Apple II GS, they had a pretty cool cover picture on this one, I thought. Is that what the box for the GS looked like, by the way?
No, so.
Okay, so they mocked that up. I didn't know for sure if it was. Interface age I'm doing these in the era of their in these groups I talked about before, but I'm doing them in order of when they came out, when they started publication. So there's a little overlap that may not make sense at times. But Interface Age started as the Southern Computer something or other, a sort of computer society, sort of a bigger than a newsletter, but not quite a magazine thing. And they put out about 8 issues. It was called Interface. And they decided, yeah, we should probably have somebody try publishing this. Somebody came and offered to, and they had some big fight about it afterwards about who owned the information. But this was the last issue before this. And this is important here, before it being Interface Age, because they have an article, they have an interview in here talking with Steve Jobs, and that's the one where Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. Jobs is the director of marketing, and Wozniak is the director of engineering for Apple. And Jobs says in this interview something about how important the hobbyist market is to them. And he says, other companies are leaving them behind. We don't want to do that. He says, if you sit down and rap with them about their needs and their wants, we can make something that works for them. And I thought that is just so 60s and so 70s. I'm going to rap with them about this stuff. And this is the Interface Now Age, real tiny up there. Oh, $1.50. I wish you could get magazines for $1.50. And this interesting thing here they came out with called the Floppy ROM. Has anybody heard of the Floppy ROM? Floppy ROM. Okay, again, in this time, we have no disk drives unless you have lots of bucks. And there's not much available for micros. So everybody's doing things with cassettes. And as they're doing things with cassettes, they've just got to read the data in, save it back out. Well, it's just a data, it's just a sound source. So these guys got the bright idea of coming up with a record, one of those floppy records. So anybody old enough to remember would remember some magazines, and they would come with a record with music on it. I even saw these things like this on the back of a cereal box that had like a story for the cartoon character on the cereal box. You cut it out, punch the hole, and just stick it on your turntable, and you hear this really lousy recording. But it was music you could, or sound you could get on a cereal box. So they had several floppy ROM. This was number 5, and this one is the one they did for the Apple II. And this is, can't see it too well on there, but it's Bill DePue and William Smith, and it's an automated dress pattern program. Now they have the code listing down here if you want to type it in. You don't want to have to put the record on it and read the data into your computer. But that was like a cassette tape. That's very unique. Nobody ever did that besides Interface Age. But it's just pretty cool. I guess so. And they did point out that the Apple II cassette routines were faster than the standard out there that all the others were using. They were using something that was equivalent to 300 baud, and the Apple II was around 1200 baud reading is what I've been coming up with. Okay, we got Micro Magazine. And with Micro, you've got Robert Tripp, who just got interviewed in the latest Open Apple. And he was involved with computers in the 60s, and later on started learning how to program. And when the 6502 trainer, the Kim 1 came out, he was pretty excited about that. So he got some of those. He started a company called The Computist and started selling the things. He said, well, I'll make this magazine to kind of help advertise my products. And so this is issue 1 of this that you can find online. And the first thing he showed was, I think he said this was the first Apple II they had east of the Mississippi or something like that. And I got a picture of it. And this is very rudimentary because it's cardboard covers. He printed it out using the Kim 1 on a printer on his kitchen table, and then pasted it together to send it for printing. Later on, of course, they got a real printer, and it got a lot more sophisticated. And eventually, they gave this cool thing of looking out from the computer to the keyboard from inside the tube, and you have a theme in each month. But it was a 6502 journal, dealt with the Apple II, dealt with the Kim, dealt with the Commodore PET. Most of the 6502 computers, they were kind of having some articles for, but he admits about half each issue really was devoted to the Apple II because it was so big. This one is the 15th issue. I guess I might have them out of order there, but this is the issue in which they had this 8-page article by William Lubert, What's Where in the Apple II, that had this Apple memory map that showed where everything was, and that's where he eventually got Lubert to convince the guy who was a professor at Dartmouth, would you please make a book out of this, and that's where the Apple II book came from, which they are now in the process of making into an iBooks book that'll have everything updated. And this is one that I've got. And again, this is cool because not only are I showing things from the screen out, but now you're showing the image of what's on the screen, looking through at the keyboard. And they're talking about graphics here, a printer bonus, Apple bonus section. He said that he came out with, put out about 40,000 issues each month. 20,000 went to subscribers, and 20,000 just went to dealers who sold, computer stores that sold them. And that's about the last issue there. They also failed when 84 came around and the advertising dollars just sunk to nothing. Call Apple. Okay, so you got to have the user groups getting involved. And I do have a couple issues that I was lucky enough to get in a box that somebody had sitting on a cabinet for years. This is volume 2. This is the second year, number 1. And it has some of the stuff on the cover. It's pretty simple. Advertisements in here from Computerland. Just basic old black and white printing. There's not like you're going to get any great color pictures on here, but it's just cool what they've started. They got a user group. They got together. They're sharing information with each other, and they're saying this is useful enough. We should print it for our members, and they just got to be a worldwide user group ultimately. Got a little more sophisticated as time passed, and these are actually pretty nice. They're shiny covered covers, that is.
They relied on the advertising dollars.
They had a little bit of advertising, like the Computerland and Omega Computer Classes is advertising on here. We had a couple printers. Who's advertising a printer on the back here? Integral Data Systems. That was one of the earlier printers that was. This had the Brighter advertised on here, which must have preceded their Paper Tiger, I think. Ultimately, though, they got a little fancier, and so you've got this one. I thought this was pretty cool. You can put DOS 3.3 on the language card and free up all that space for your program. Not that I ever used it. I mean, it's not like this was something that I was a solution in need of a problem in need of a solution that I had, but I just thought, wow, that is so cool. So they were great in AppleSoft internal structure. That was amazing if you want to do programming in assembly, so you knew how to use the routines. What was zero page being used for?
And you couldn't do it nowadays.
No, it's just too complicated now.
Also,
I couldn't do it.
You couldn't get in.
They started getting, then by May 84, they started getting a little bit more sophisticated. This is the Apple IIc intro issue, and I love this just because it's got the HeatKit Hero robot holding the Apple IIc coming out of the box, and on the floor is the Call Apple magazine that we're looking at. With this thing on the back here was the advertisement for one of the accelerator things, and I just like that kind of artwork. That's cool. These two issues I like because it's historical. It's got Steve Wozniak talking about his earlier days through user group, and then more of the story that he had the next month as the Apple IIgs is being introduced. And anniversary issues are important to me. Later on, they had changed the name to Tech Alliance because Apple didn't like the business having Apple in its name, although they let the magazine keep its name. And then the last issue, when they found they just weren't getting enough renewals to keep it going, they had to say goodbye.
What month was that?
That's winter of 1990.
Oh.
I call it January. Hard to say exactly when it was precisely, but that's when that one came out. So let's back up again a little bit, and we'll look at Contact. Contact was something that Apple itself put out. They realized in the early days, I have one of those myself, that came in this box from this guy, Contact number 5. That's where Apple realized they need the user groups to do their support. Everybody can't support everybody around the country from where they are. They had no Apple stores. So there's nowhere to go for user support except the user groups, where you had your smart people who knew how to use it. And you can get somebody new come in, hey, I bought this, I can't get my printer card to work, I don't know what to do. So they came up with the idea of having Contact to keep contact with user groups. And this is where they introduced the Disk 2, June of '78. Each issue has some topic that they dealt with, talking about their hotline here. And ultimately they had a best of that they put out. But this is from Apple. Yes, Apple made these, but it's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 pages. And that's about as much as they did. They were not, and they really didn't want to be in the business of putting out a magazine. Well, this is ending up, around the time where these user groups are starting to be bigger. So they said, I think we have a better idea. And we'll talk about that in a little bit later. Softside. Okay, now we have some people getting involved with this. Softside started as a TRS-80 publication, and they realized there's a lot of apples out there. Let's make an Apple edition. And this was more like, it would be, I don't have any copies of this, but I get the impression it would be about that big, and it was not the shiny cover type magazine. And this is the one that had the printout listings that were so hard to read that some people said that you had to put on special glasses to see it or something. It was just not very easy to look at. You can see these aren't super, this is almost like some of the throwaway magazines that you see at the grocery store. But it's a place to get programs. You want something to do with your computer, you want games, you can't afford to buy any, type them in from here. And later they had Softside selections instead of the Apple edition. Okay, Peelings 2. Peelings 2, I can't find out a whole lot from the writer, because the publisher, because he intends to send me something, but he has a busy life and he never quite gets around to it. But Peelings 2, primarily speaking, had product reviews, sort of the consumer reports of the Apple II world. So if you want to know which was the best word processor to get, they would sort of do consumer reports on you. They'd say, well, it's, on these categories, this is how processor A stacks up, this is how processor B stacks up, and you could actually look at these things and decide, well, which one do I want to get? They did have some other stuff like Anything Machine, AppleSoft. They had other stuff they talked about here besides their reviews. But that was what you would get Peelings for, because it said it was a magazine of software and Apple hardware and software evaluation. And these are 2 issues that I've got myself. Do not remember where I got them from, but I have those 2 there. That's about it for Peelings, and I think Andy's got more of them. This is the one I'm interested in to see if I could find out what they had to say about those online services back in 1983. And this was late in its run. We're up to chapter 8, data debasement. I'm not sure what that's talking about. Database management. Nibble. Well, Nibble is one that, of course, Mike Harvey started in his living room. I got this one here, and it was all focused on what can you type in to use for yourself. I mean, they had other stuff too. Ultimately, Nibble was cool because they had people writing articles about how to disassemble things and how to what you could do with it. This is issue 3, and Nibble was also known, just like Bytes was known for having great covers. Nibble was known for having great cover art too. Very interesting things they did on this. I got a chance to be published a couple times in Nibble. I saw one article to them called Slot Finder, where a little basic program, you would scan your slots and look for codes and then compare it to a database of known what says you have a serial printer card and a disk card. Of course, it depended on whether you had the bytes to identify what they were, so it was very limited, but I thought it's kind of cool, and they bought it. The other one they bought, they never printed. It was an if, then, else for BASIC that I patched into the character get routine to make it work. I felt pretty proud about that. And they bought it, but they never published it, so that's fine. I got paid. Of course, anniversary issue. And towards the end, again, Mike Kirby did not die out in '84 when all these others did. That's because he was a businessman before he did this. He knew how to take care of a business and didn't overextend himself, depend solely on advertising, because he advertised his own products and his old issues and the discs that came with them. But he didn't depend on it, so he was able to go quite a ways. This is April '91, getting close to the end. They've had to scale back the magazine. It's got the 3-hole punch there. It has 3 colors. The covers aren't that. I mean, yeah, there's more colors up there, but it was not as colorful as it had been in the old days. And it wasn't too long before it was gone, and he sold his subscriber list to Tom Weisar. Apple Orchard. We ran the clock back in to Apple Orchard. After Apple got done with his contact run, they said, what are we going to do? Well, about the time of the, you can't see this over here, well, the 5th West Coast Computer Fair, several of the user groups said, we need to make something we can distribute there to tell people, here's where we are, here's where you can come get information. So they came out with their magazine, Apple Orchard. This is actually a pretty thick issue. This has got 100 pages in it.
Wow.
And it's got a lot of stuff if you want to know what to do with your Apple II. This has stuff from the international, well, they formed the International Apple Corps for this, but it had contributions from Apple Bay Computer User Society, the San Francisco Apple Corps, the APPLE, Houston Apple Users Group, Michigan, New England, Philadelphia, several they had involved with this. And they all contributed some articles to it. Ultimately, it was Call Apple that had a lot of stuff in here. In issue number 2, you'll notice here it says including contact. So they had an article that was supposed to go in issue 7 of Contact. They stuck in here. And they had actually gone to Apple and said, hey, could we work out something? Apple said, yes, why don't you take over the mailing list and you can take care of these user groups. And so they're dealing with the Apple III here and some special things about graphics. And they moved on and kept publishing, and they were quarterly. Yeah, I think they're more quarterly. That was biannual, bi-monthly, and then went quarterly. And they had a cool cover, and they had a lot of stuff they talked about, not just Apple II. And this is like one of the last issues I've got, January '84. But and I like this one because it had a double high-res routine you could type in and do like the graphic demo in colors. And again, with that 1984 thing that happened, they got in trouble and they fell out too. SoftTalk, well, I've blabbed on about SoftTalk before, but you remember when this story about SoftTalk has to actually do with a company in the early days. Now, here we got our 70s flower power, 60s flower power picture for the Apple II, and you got what your Apple II was. You had a cassette recorder, you had an Apple II, and you had a TV. You did not have a disk drive for the first your first year at least, and if you had money, you got one after the first year, but they still sold cassettes well into 82 or 83. And so we had a company called SoftTalk that was out there, and they were writing and distributing software, taking submissions. You remember if you were here last year, we had Bob Bishop talking about a program he did, Apple Talker, that he sold as a cassette through SoftTalk. And there's one of those cassettes. There's a catalog they had, and there's another catalog they had. So look at, they had a lot of products at that time. And they actually came out with their own little kind of newsletter about their company, about their products called SoftTalk. There's 3 issues of this that were produced. There's only 2 of them that have had any scans show up on the internet from William V.R. Smith's website. But it turned out that Margot Tomervik, who had bought an Apple II with her winnings from being on Password, got a couple programs, loved it. She found out that she lived very close together, so they made contact. And ultimately, an agreement was made between SoftTalk, whose name later changed to Artsci, A-R-T-S-C-I, that Magic Window word processor. And they said, okay, we'll take SoftTalk and make it into a color magazine, a slick magazine with national distribution. And they both put money into it, and they made a partnership to make this happen. This is not the first issue. This is kind of a flyer about the first issue. There's obviously not too many of these out here, but this is September of 1980. And they got Darth Vader on the cover, and a story about Apple, Exec Apple. That was their story, so they profiled companies. This is one I actually own. It's from March of '81. It's hard to find these on eBay, and I got outbid when there were some earlier ones I hope to get my hands on. Obviously, now I'm paying the price for not having kept mine. SoftTalk was great. As I think we've had Randy Brandt or Ron Romero, somebody else talked about how wonderful SoftTalk was, and it was so great reading this stuff. It was about the industry a bit more than about anything else. They talked about the companies doing it, the people doing it. They had articles talking about so-and-so left this company and went out to this company, and they're making this product now. Kind of industry insider news type things, you might say. But they also put out a bunch of articles on other subjects. And they had things that were like, you wouldn't think about talking about an Apple II with baseball players. But they got some people using an Apple II involved with baseball. They got an article about serious software here. Apples and farming? Yeah, well, there's stuff like that. Preview from 1984, here's Bert Kersey we had talked about. There's Roger Wagner. Several people whose names I should probably know. Wise is on there. But I don't know who the other people are because I don't have the issue to look at right here in front of me. talking about using it with dance. And this article had to do with how they were taking pictures sequentially and trying to find a way to document and record dance. There really is no way you can do it with music, you can do it with paper, and how do you document a dance? You have to kind of teach it to other people. Well, they're looking at ways at that time in '84 about how to document dance on a computer with an Apple II. The last issue, August '84, and it disappeared, unfortunately. Movie 2010. Now, does anybody remember what role an Apple II played in that movie?
Hayward Floyd.
Yeah, what was he doing
On the
with it?
beach with a portable.
That's right. He had an Apple IIc in 2010, 2 years ago. He's using an Apple IIc on the beach with the LCD display. Obviously, the present.
And never mind, you wouldn't be able to see it in the beach light.
That's right. You have to be able to see it. Just like you can't necessarily see your iPad at the beach.
Power cord.
That's another issue. Now they had to create a lot of people who got their start writing for SoftTalk. You got Roger Wagner with his company Southwest Data Systems, and then Roger Wagner Publishing. He did an something about assembly programming. Started out a couple things he did through almost the entire run before it changed on to somebody else. William V.R. Smith, one of the two people who put the money in there, he's got an article about BASIC. Bert Kersey with his DOS Talk column. I love these pictures. And then Tom Weisar took over later. And again, this is just great. Make it look like an old Texaco station with the disk drives in there. They had a lot of fun with this. This was not a magazine you look at and say, oh, they're very serious. No, they were having a blast. Graphically speaking, Mark Pazarski, who remembers what he did? Penguin Software ultimately had changed names to Polarwork as Penguin Books objected. And they were also, Penguin was one of the first companies to take the copy protection off their disks. Jeffrey Mazur, anybody know what he did? I mean, he had a lot of columns about hardware stuff in here, and he ultimately worked for Applied Ingenuity, was one of the people making some of those cool things that never quite saw the market that you could stick inside an Apple IIc or IIc Plus, a built-in modem, built-in extra memory and accelerator and so on. Jim Merritt, how many knows who Jim Merritt is? He was somebody who worked at Apple, and he said, you guys should have a column about Pascal. They said, go ahead and submit it, we'll take it. So he thought he'd do a couple. He wrote this for nearly the entire run of the magazine. And he was involved with, I think, System 6 development. Bill Budge, Pinball Construction Set, had a column about graphics for for quite a while. Taylor Coleman, he's another Apple guy, wrote this article about the Apple III and the Apple III Business Basic. So SoftTalk just had a lot of stuff that it did that was important. Computus Magazine is exciting, or is interesting to read about too, and I got this information thanks to Mike McGinnis and what he put on his site for Apple Scans with permission of the publisher. This guy, Charles Haight, was annoyed because he had software he bought that he couldn't back up, and companies that were making programs like Locksmith or Back It Up or there's another one, Copy 2 Plus, were being banned from magazines because when a magazine said, when they got wind that a magazine was going to publish an ad by Omega Software that published Locksmith, some of the other publishers said, we're not going to put ads in your magazine this month unless you take them out. Well, they had no choice but to take them out. So he had the idea that this is wrong. I'm going to make something where I'm going to give people the tools to let you back up your copy protected disks. And so this is issue 1 of that. Issue 2, they call it Hardcore Computing. Issue 3, and then they also had some things where they had specialty issues that came out parallel to it. Core was about graphics, number 1. Number 2 was about utilities, and number 3 was about games. And later they decided, well, let's try to put this back together again. So they call it Hardcore in small letters, Computus. Still put out all the parameters to let you back up and copy your software. Now, ostensibly, yes, this is so I can back up my legally purchased disk. Unofficially, it's so I can copy disks with my friends, like those copy parties that Tony was talking about. And the majority of what was on here, I mean, they had some articles about other things, but the majority of what they had in these things was basically how to back up the software, because it was always an arms race We make a new system like the spiral disk thing that Tony was talking about. Somebody says, here's how we're going to copy a spiral disk, you know. And this is coming into December '87. This guy didn't have a whole lot of publishing dollars. He relied mostly on subscription fees to put his thing out, and he was dedicated. I mean, he went many years beyond what these others did. But of course, the advertising downturn didn't necessarily hurt him, and some companies finally did say, well, okay, we'll advertise in your magazine, even though you're advertising stuff that cracks software. But all this stuff here in this small type talks about all the programs they have soft keys for this month on how to deprotect. And it gets a little simpler. RDEX features, reader, I can't remember exactly what it stood for, but it's reader contributed soft keys. And he got to the point that he said, I'm only going to publish your stuff if you'll send it to me on a disk. So you type your article, all your keys on a disk, and send it to me. That way they don't have to retype it from what you send in and have errors, because this is a lot of hex codes and so on. And they put it up there. Of course, people sometimes say, hey, that one didn't work for me. This is what I had to change to make it work. So they put that stuff in there too. And towards the end, and I don't remember what this is getting up towards like 91 or something like that. He had to change it to like a newsletter, a newspaper style. It was something that sounds like about this big, more newspaper-like, because it's just getting, how do we find ways to cut down the cost of publishing this thing? And that was one way to do it. This is one of the last issues they had come out with. To computing, I'll just go over it quickly. It was there for maybe a couple years and it was gone. I've got one issue here, I got one issue here, and I don't know anything else about it. Insider. Okay, now we have, this is the end of the independent publishers. Now we're getting into the big publishers. We're getting Ziff Davis involved. We're getting IDG involved. And they're smelling money, and so they say, dang, we're going to put out a magazine. So Wayne Green comes out with Insider. Wayne Green started Bytes magazine, and after about 6 issues, there was some messy divorce happening. His wife was was with him in the endeavor. And he came to his office one day like everything was gone, and they'd taken and pulled it up and moved it elsewhere. He was out of it. He started Kilobyte magazine, Kilobaud. He wanted to call it Kilobyte, and it was changed to Kilobaud, ultimately to Microcomputing magazine. It didn't last as long as Byte did, but he did other magazines too. He had done stuff with ham radio before he did the computer things. But this is the issue number 1 in January of '83, and again, you got the big publishers involved. They're sucking up advertising dollars, because if you have an opportunity to go with a news magazine that's got 100,000 circulation versus 20,000 circulation, well, that's some better expenditure of my advertising dollars for my company. So unfortunately, we lost it from SoftTalk and P-Links and some of these others that couldn't get the dollars anymore, and that's what caused that problem. In fact, SoftTalk had this huge 250, almost 300-page issue in December that had a huge profile of software. If you want to see what was going on in December of '83, you look at that thing and they have profiles of tons of things in there. Unfortunately, they got very little money from the advertisers for that, and that kind of caused them a big cash crunch over the next few months, and that led to SoftTalk's downfall. This is a famous one here. When the Apple II GS came out, we got Woz on the cover. It's amazing! So that one would be a great collector issue. And they went on through about 80, and I have my notes on here if this was going to work the way it would, but they went on to a point where they realized they can't really do it by themselves, and they ultimately combined with this one, A+. It's a really lousy picture here of an early issue of A+, and I can't even tell you what it is except it's volume 1 something.
I think that's the premier issue.
Is that the premier issue? That could be. This is the one that John Romero had his program published in. This is off of his website. And then I like this one because it has a picture of all the disk drives.
Oh, that's cool.
And Steve Wozniak up there for the 10th anniversary of the Apple II. So we're in 1987 now. And they had a lot of good articles they put out with. I did read this one. I didn't get this one because I was not really involved with getting new glossy magazines at the time. I wish I had, and I need to look at some of them more. Mr. Carrington Banston had 2 issues of this that I had to scan, and ultimately I stole them from him. This one's just had a great couple of articles about how you run Apple II and IBM stuff together. A card you can plug in your Apple II to let it run IBM, a card you can plug in your IBM to let it run Apple II stuff. And I scanned so much of it, I just took the magazine. But as I went through and scanned ads in this, I've done this since I've been here, there's this really creepy ad for Jeannie. It's like, oh yeah, I want to get on Jeannie and have that back looking at me.
I do not want
yes, VA Retriever signed this ad. This is how you could retrieve more on Jeannie for less money. And here's the lesser dollars you spend on Jeannie if you compare to CompuServe and other services. But it's like, ooh.
Where is he now?
This guy here? I hope they put him in the pound. I don't know. I think this is around '88, so I think this might be around the time when they asked Tom Weisar to take over the Apple II stuff on Jeannie, and he did a much better job promoting it than VA Retriever could. But I had to put that up there because it was so creepy. And this was like one of the latter issues before they combined with Insider. In between there, let's talk about the Apple IIgs Buyer's Guide, again, as we're moving forward in the timeline. Redgate Publishing had been putting out a lot of different magazines for years, and they at one point put out a magazine about MS-DOS software, just almost like what SoftTalk did, where they had a lot of reviews and things, capsule reviews, listings of vendors, things like that. And when the when the Macintosh was getting ready to come out, the guy who was the evangelist, Guy Kawasaki, got the publisher of Redgate and Steve Jobs talking with each other, and Steve Jobs said, I want something that's going to do this for the Mac. So he came out, they wanted to come out with the Macintosh Buyer's Guide. Now, I want to get a picture of a copy of the Macintosh Buyer's Guide to put on the internet. So I searched for Redgate Publishing and Macintosh Buyer's Guide, and I found all these pictures from my website. So it's like, I don't know what they were doing. Apparently nobody out there cares enough about the Macintosh Buyer's Guide to have bothered scanning anything to put up on the internet. You can find nothing about that. You can't find anything about the MS-DOS Buyer's Guide or whatever they call that thing there. It's not out there. But I got all these pictures from my website popped up, probably because I have Redgate in the article that this comes off of, and so they're going to stick it up there.
If you have Redgate once, is it the same as having it a dozen times in articles, or just having a...
It's just the way Google indexes things.
You don't know having multiple...
Yeah, I have no idea why, but I tried multiple ways to do it. I found the Amiga Buyer's Guide on somebody's website. This is a Redgate publication, so they had an Amiga Buyer's Guide too. They had a publication called Compact that was about compact magazines, again put up by Redgate. It got bought out by AOL years ago, and they got all the assets of it, and it's just like nobody's sufficiently, if it still exists, nobody's sufficiently motivated to put any images up there. So with the success of the Macintosh Buyer's Guide, they thought, maybe we should do this for the Apple II. So in fall of '85, they come out with the Apple II review, where here's all about the Apple II GS here. We got the GS, we got the Scribe printer, AppleWorks and so on. And they did okay. They had a couple issues of this, and later on they said, let's do something that's about the GS. So they have the starting issue of this now in the fall of '87, featuring Pastimes in Tonetown on the cover, a game. And so they did a lot of the same stuff with this, and they came out probably about 7 or 8 issues. It was more quarterly, semi-annual kind of a thing. But at some point, they had a lot of product listings. And I remember seeing this at, it was either Barnes & Noble or one of the Walden bookstore at the local mall. This is one you could actually pick up off the news shelf and look and perhaps purchase it. And they just had a lot of stuff. I wonder where those kids are today. I don't have this one, but I thought this was interesting, particularly says Apple to support the line well into the 1990s. I thought there's a misplaced comma there. Apple to support the line well into the 1990s. And this is the final issue of it that they came out with. Okay, so we have Insider and A+. The market's shrinking down. They decided to combine together, form Insider A+. And this is one of the early issues of that. And they had some cool cover art too. And they had useful, again, I didn't subscribe this to this. I don't have enough issues to really say, here's what they had in there. But there was a lot of people that liked it. And this is getting towards the end of the run here, as we're kind of getting farther down. But remember the controversy on Jeannie as they were saying, they were trying to say, okay, our market's shrinking, we need to get a few more readers. Let's put some Macintosh articles in here. Uh-oh, Hyper Studio for the Macintosh. And that just got all the Apple II people just frothing at the mouth. Because we hated the Macintosh. It's taking away money from our computer, which was supporting them, darn it. And so ultimately they had some brouhaha on Jeannie. Oh, they're canceling it. It was almost like Apple rumors today. And somebody actually came on and said, no, we're not canceling it. We're going to go a few more issues. They actually changed it to a new Macintosh Magazine when they canceled Insider 8+, and that went one issue, and then they got rid of it because it wasn't going anywhere.
What was that one?
It's in my notes, I'm afraid. It's just like some sort of Macintosh. I'd have to look up. They had one issue, though, and I've not seen pictures of it anywhere.
Was that the Insider or A+, or Insider A+, where you could look at the reviews and they would have them marked,
I didn't read it enough. I didn't read it enough to know what was in there really, because by that time I was on Jeannie. I was getting Open Apple or A2 Central. I really wasn't getting any new magazines. Apple Assembly, I only have just the one I'm going to show you here. This was again more of almost a newsletter type thing, and this is published by the guy who did the SC Assembler, Bob Sanders Cederloff, and he did this to talk about his stuff and programs he was writing, things you can do with his assembler. 18-digit Mac. He was writing arithmetic that you could do on your Apple II using 18-digit precision. So he had his own floating point routines he was writing in this part 7 of this article here. This had a lot of interesting things he put in there. I think I subscribed for about a year for this. Open Apple. Okay, now this was like the child of SoftTalk, because when SoftTalk passed away, we have Uncle DOS survived SoftTalk bankruptcy. Tom Weisar was writing, you remember the DOS Talk column, and I love what he says on here. He says, Uncle DOS, the beloved character of SoftTalk Magazine's DOS Talk column, is in good condition after a close brush with death. He will appear monthly in Open Apple newsletter for the Apple II, written by Tom Weisar. And he says, Matthew Monitor and whatever the basic guy was. They had this picture they had made for the Apple II Forever event that they got from some old wood cutting, apparently. And this is Tom Weisar, at least his picture for his My 2 Bits column, which is actually not too different from how he looks here.
What's the cartoonist, Thomas
Yeah.
Nast?
No,
One of those figures.
It wouldn't be surprising.
He brought down the tweed ring.
But
All those
Open
cartoons.
Apple is very information dense. Small print, a newsletter about 8 pages or so, but he had a lot of cool information on it. He looked at it as something that was for intermediate users. It wasn't for beginners, and it wasn't for the advanced heavy programmer, but it's something in between that you could use. And he had contacts with the industry. Demoralized Apple II division announces an enhanced 2D and an inventory backlog. So he had people from the company at that time. They weren't being prohibited from talking to people, and they were talking to him and telling what's going on, and he told us all about it. So a lot of my attitude, my tude about the Apple II and Apple computer came from this guy here. They had these Rich Tennant cartoons that they reproduced in there, and a lot of them they changed the taglines for them a little bit to be Apple II specific from times, but they just had a lot of cool information. Had changed the name to A2 Central after a while because again, Apple just didn't like people having their name in magazines. And they had somewhere around here I don't know if I can find it right now. Oh yeah. Again, if you want to look at a catalog that shows what's selling at this era of winter 1990 and 91, I like what they have to say on there. Although we'll see 2001 before we see the end of the Apple II. We haven't seen the end of it. It's getting thin, but we haven't seen the end of it. But it wasn't because of we had still products for it. And then we're the Apple experts. They had a lot of stuff. You got a fairly big business going with the stuff he did, not only in the newsletter, but stuff said, here's a place I can sell my products through them. In here, I have all these catalogs that they would come out with every month where they have specials on tons of stuff, including the technical reference manuals. Ultimately, the market began to shrink for them too. They took on Nibble's subscribers after Nibble went down, and it didn't. A lot of them didn't resubscribe, so that was part of the paper newsletter. They had to shrink down to January '94. This is important to me because around that time I got involved helping contribute news that I skimmed off of Jeannie to this. And so Doug Cuff was editing it, and I was putting news in there, and so it was on disk. It's very much like we've been doing with Jeannie Lamp, but it was on here, and it was fun to do. That's the last issue that came out by ICON, the International Computer Owners Network. And I got to come to KansasFest in '94 because I was one of the writers. And here were some of the other things they had. They had Stack Central, which was about Hyper Studios. No, HyperCard. Studio City was about Hyper Studios. Script Central, another one of them script things, and then Timeout Central about the
Script
Timeout.
Central was HyperCard, and Stack Central was the earlier issues of Studio City. They changed the name partly.
Okay, thank you. And they had this. I can't find much of this. Somebody sent me one of these files. It was almost like a help file for Windows, but he tried branching out to have a Windows newsletter called Solid Windows instead of Open Apple. You got Solid Windows, and I don't have a way of looking at this now. This is the only thing I've got is this picture I took years ago. And this was John Peters was doing this. He's the guy who started the Jeannie publications originally. Okay, AppleWorks Forum real briefly. They started that with Warner Williams and Kathleen Merritt. Had been giving talks about AppleWorks, and at some teachers convention or educators convention, they said we should make a group, so they formed a group right there, the National AppleWorks Users Group, and came up with the Forum, AppleWorks Forum publication. And this went for several years, and it was a big place. I mean, Randy Brandt talked about how he was on a panel with them, and they sponsored him being at one of those Apple Fests. And this is one of the latter ones right here, running AppleWorks on PC and Macintosh computers. GS Plus magazine. I don't have any issues of this. I have the logo. But this is Steve Disbrow, who was another person who's heavily involved in the early KansasFests. He, like Tom Weisar, had a business. He said there's no disc magazines out there. I mean, Amiga's got it, Atari ST's got it. They got a disc and magazine together. There's no magazine plus disc for the Apple IIgs, so he started one. And he ran for several years on that, wrote a lot of software that went into it himself. I just don't have any cover art to put on it because I haven't spent the money to buy any from Syndicom, but
How many issues do you want?
maybe a couple just to scan, you know. Two Alive, okay, the brouhaha on Jeannie about Insider and A+, and at that time, you know, I remember the place when advertisers were going to pull out of the magazines because Locksmith was going to advertise. Well, around that time, we had Quality Computers, which was getting pretty big in terms of selling things. You know, they got the AppWorks thing going, products and hardware and software. They were threatening to pull out of Insider A+ if they closed it down or went Mac only. So they decided, heck it, we're going to start our own magazine. And so they started Two Alive here. And this is who got a hardcover. I'm trying to remember what month that's from. What year that's from? 93. So 92, 93 is when this showed up. And they had some fairly, you know, good articles in these. This is one I did subscribe to because I said, yeah, I'm going to support an Apple publication. That stupid Insider. KansasFest article about 94. Tale of One City. So, I mean, this is where a lot of the stuff about KansasFest interviews, advertising came up from, was from other publications. But again, the market shrank down. There's something that really collapsed fairly quickly about the whole market after the Apple IIe stopped production in 93. Things really plummeted fast. And so they had to cut down to something that was bigger than a newsletter, but not much better. And they had Doug Cuff was editing some by then, but they ran through several editors at the end, and it just kind of faded on the vine.
We're about out of time.
Oh, shoot. Okay. Talk too much.
I don't need much time. You can go another 10 minutes.
Okay. Joe Cowan, Shareware Solutions 2, he was writing an insider for a program column called Shareware Solutions, and when Insider A+ went belly up, he started his own thing, spring of '94. And there's some of those still up there that if you want to get some of these. I read through these that are available from Ewan Wannock's website as I was looking for stuff about KansasFest, and it's like, yeah, he's got actually fairly good articles he wrote about this stuff. He's been involved for years in shareware stuff. And so here's his KansasFest '98 report. And the date, post KansasFest '98, getting a little non-specific here towards the end. And pre-KansasFest '99, this is the last issue they came out with. But Internet World 1999 talks about what's going on with the internet then, and the online services and where they're at, where they're coming from. Apple Blossom, a short-lived 3-issue newsletter, again by somebody who's an educator. He did something other educators wanted to know about, so he made a newsletter. Also came up with a HyperCard publication. Only about 2 of those were produced, because that's a lot more involved making HyperCard things. And you've heard of this one here. The guy who started JuiceGS was the publisher, Max Jones from Indiana. He wanted something to put out there. He created this on AppleWorks GS painfully and uploaded it to the online services in the end of '95, the beginning of '96. The roller coaster ride of '95, ups and downs, and there was a whole market at that time, and it was well received. And ultimately, this was taken over by Syndicom after a few years with Sheppy as publisher and Ryan Sunaga as the editor. And later on, we've got Ken taking over as editor and later as publisher too, with articles about many things, including the Apple III, and getting some more color on the covers here after a while. And this is the latest one here with that famous cover. And they're still going. Okay, quickly, so the disc publication. Soft Disc started, this is one of the earlier ones, and it was just, they put it out on disc, it was a magazine on a disc. They sold advertising by the sector. So 256 bytes of advertising. It can get you, at a time. And if you did it in text, you could get a lot of stuff on there. If you want some graphics, it costs a little more money, But that's the first issue there. This is one they had as a free demo that was CalcMan. It was cool. It was the game written in BASIC. It looked like a VisiCalc screen. You had to push the space bar to change the cursor up and down, to go sideways or up and down, because there's no up and down arrow keys. But they had this, you had this block here chasing, I don't remember what the ghost was, but chasing to eat up these things around the maze before the ghosts, which looked like something else, got you. CalcMan. And they came up with some more sophisticated covers over time. And it's pretty cool. This was the first real disc publication out there, and they went for a long time. They were one of the longer running things. Towards its end, it actually was almost being totally run by one guy in terms of putting it together and assembling what was submitted and so on. But finally, all things, good things had to come to an end, so here's a little tear in his eye. Issue 166, and at the very end of their goodbyes, they had their own version of the To Infinitum logo that they put on there. And SoftDisk GS, they also came out with, I can't get this to run well on my emulator, so this is the only one I was able to get to boot up to get a cover image from. This is actually the last issue of SoftDisk GS. Scholastic Microzine I'd never even heard of until last year, but this was Scholastic Magazine, the company that made it. They said, hey, we should get some of this computer stuff for kids. And so they came out with this, and this was, I think, the article I ever interviewed one of the people that was on the E.T. movie. And I saw Carrington and Ken playing this last year. That first issue, they made kind of catawampus like that because it stood out, but afterwards they came, that is what the magazine looked like on the disc. But they came out with stuff that was a little bit more normal, and it was really focused on the teachers. See, inside here you got a teacher booklet as well as the discs. So the teacher knows what you're teaching on here, what you can do with your students. So it's kind of grades 4 to 6. Then they had Microzine Junior, and I have some now, but I didn't put the scans. I don't think I put the scans in here. No. But they had some stories that you could put in here, and this is for kindergarten to age to grade 4. And Lorraine Hopping, who helped write some of those, she's somebody that I found on the internet. She had mentioned something, and so she was glad to get information about what she could about the history of it. The end dates are a little foggy because she couldn't remember it, and nobody at Scholastic will respond to me, so I'm not big enough potatoes. Uptime was the magazine that John Romero and Lane Roth went to work with. And they started in '84, I think, if I remember correctly. But they're about 4 years behind SoftTalk, or SoftDisk, pardon me. And yeah, it's an okay cover, but the content inside was just kind of lame initially. Ultimately, they did get, and look at this. He's got volume 12, volume 11. He started with volume 10. He gives you the impression with this stuff, oh yeah, we have this huge market out there for people, but it wasn't, I don't think, even, I mean, yes, it was taking a little bit of money from SoftDisk because they were selling it at a lower cost, and ultimately Lane Roth helped put together a more graphic interface for selecting things than what they had, and that's part of what prompted SoftDisk to say, let's buy you out. And so they bought them out. This was their graphic thing they had come up with for their articles, and they went to work down to Louisiana to work with SoftDisk ultimately. And that last one, which I jumped or passed too much, has Dangerous Dave on the last issue, which is Romero's program there. Jeannie, we're getting into digital publications now too. He got on the Jeannie, and John Peters had done an online newsletter for the Atari ST. He got on Jeannie and said, hey, we should have something like that on here. He approached Jeannie. They said, sure. So he came up with Jeannie Lamp ST in June of '90, and they wanted to expand to other things. I don't even remember what TX2 is for. There's just so little information you can find about Jeannie Lamp other than Apple II, because nobody else took the pains that I can aware of. I mean, it's probably out there somewhere, but nobody else took the pains to preserve this stuff like the Apple II thing people did. We're hanging on, we're the underdogs, we're hanging on to what we can get. So they had all these Jeannie Lamp publications here. Apple II starts in '92 along with IBM and Mac, and they get some others later on. And the last issue, you know, it's the one that hung on the longest, October '97 was the Apple II version. That's when the whole computer system, Jeannie computer system, is crapping out on them half the time.
What was that last one? The unknown start date.
Jeannie Lamp PR. I think it had to do with public relations or product or just PR stuff for Jeannie.
I think TX2 was Tandy.
Okay. So this is what you would see if you were going to download Jeannie Lamp and look at it on your computer. This is the first issue, April of '92, and they use this format for all of them, where they had this little three-letter code, which they never really used, but it's an indexing code. And some years ago, I actually indexed the entire run of Jeannie Lamp A2. So if I ever get around to putting that on the internet again, I had it on when Ryan had his site up, but it'd be a way of looking for articles in here if you want to. And they used a lot of ASCII art like you saw on the online services. Those are the cowtoons that they came up with. And at the very end, Ryan Suinaga became the editor like in the last year of it. And even though by the end, most of these things were not even being done anymore, if nothing else, just to honor them, he put them in the last issue at the very end of them about here's the people who were staff on the other Jeannie Lamp publications. There's your, Kent Fillmore was the publisher, and John Peters was the editor, and then Tom Schmitz was the co-editor. But pretty soon after, we had change over to Doug Cuff as the editor, and he ran through almost the rest of all of it. This is starting in '93. And then later on, of course, that turned into the Lamp. Everybody was migrating from Jeannie to Delphi. He started the Lamp, Ryan did, and here's his first issue here. Did that for a number of years, and later on turned the editorship over to Lyle Syverson. And Lyle kept that going through 2007 when there just wasn't enough news. He was gleaning off of the Syndicat board to keep putting anything up. And real quick, we got some foreign magazines. There's Palms from France. These are images you can get online. We have Trimplin Micro, and I have one issue of that here that I got from Randy Brandt. It's not up on there, but this is issue number 1 you see on the screen. And we have from Britain, Hardcore. This is where the Ewan Wanop is involved. Hardcore was their initial magazine of the British Apple Systems User Group. And they changed it to Apple 2000 later on for a better name, starting around the early 90s. Late 80s, early 90s, but they also started having trouble keeping it going, and I think November '92, December '92 was their end run. They kept up with things non-Apple II. They had Macintosh stuff in there as well, but it's by then they said, you know, these just don't have enough money to keep the user group running, so they shut it down. Windfall was a magazine in Britain as well, and I contacted a guy that was involved with that. He sent me some issues of it for the cost of shipping. A little moldy, but they're good. And Windfall was what they call in Britain apples that blow off a tree in a storm. And later on they said, well, Windfall doesn't really tell us much about what this is about. Let's change the name to Apple User. Well, I think Windfall is a far better name because if you want to search for Apple User on Google, you ain't going to get many hits for this magazine.
They probably weren't thinking of that back then.
No, they did not come to mind. But Apple user came up later on. This would be Harry Potter and his friends playing with an Apple II. And later they had the Apple logo up there, and Apple didn't seem to mind, but they wanted to try to turn it into Mac user. But some other company started Mac user there, and Apple put all their advertising dollars behind them, so they stopped publishing. And then down under, we have the Australian Apple Review. This is issue 1, and one of the things was how good is a fake Apple? So they're talking about stuff, the clones even back then, because in Australia you couldn't get the real thing very quickly, but it was easy to get access to the clones. And apparently from that article you get what you pay for. Just like buying a cheap car and starts falling apart, you buy a cheap clone and it starts falling apart. They did this with a cover. I don't really have anything but the first year of covers. This has been scanned for one of the websites that Bill Martins is involved with, but they haven't gone past year 1. Any questions? Yes?
Just comments. I had an apartment full of magazines a number of years ago after one of the KansasFest. Sheffy was still living in Tracy. A friend of his, working in the library at UC Berkeley, was going to scan all these magazines. And I said, well, I want them, but I think you should scan them. So I took the carload full of stuff up to his house. Never saw or heard from him again, which is too bad. But I always depended upon looking at the old magazines, reading the articles, but also looking at the ads to see what was out and what their capacities are, because the ads were fairly well written.
I've got actually taken some of my soft talks and I've gone through, and I got started and then got distracted by something else. But I was going through and scanning, making a little index of the articles, not a complicated one, but an index, but also scanning in all those cool old ads. That's what I did with these A+s here. When I saw Carrington had them, I was going through and scanning the ads from them because they're actually pretty fascinating. It's like, I remember that ad, I remember that ad. Because you'd see it every month. You'd see it in several different magazines.
Right.
And some of them are, like that Jeannie one, are pretty unusual. So, anything else?
Did Apple Blossom ever have anything on disc that you know of?
Just the hyper card publication. They had it as a print thing, just like Joe Cohn's thing was a print thing, but I don't think it was ever put out as a PDF. And the publisher is still around. Whether he has an interest in producing any PDF type version of it or not, I don't know. If he still even has any printed versions, I don't know. But to my knowledge, it hasn't been put up anywhere if it exists.
I think there were some early versions in AppleWorks GS that were online, but I don't know. I don't know if they're available.
I think you're right that that's where he put out some of the early ones, and then he started printing it. But the story is a little hazy to me because it's been a few months since I last was looking at this in intent.
And the big red computer, I didn't see much on that.
I didn't say anything about that, mainly because I just don't have any information about it, and there's a story there too. All these, like I said, are rise and fall stories, and they probably should be told, but at some point, if I don't get the information, I don't have anything to put out there, or if I didn't have any interaction with it. Sometimes it's hard to find much to say about it if I didn't use it. A+ and Insider, all I can put on there is what people told me about it in Jeannie back in the day, and I may be having these 2 issues and looking at some of the scans, I can learn more if I decide I want to write more about it. Yes, Carol?
I think I still got a bunch of big red publications. It's basically a catalog magazine.
I mean, Joe Cohn wrote some stuff for Big Red Computer Club, the Scarlet newsletter, but
and I've got a bunch of those.
Okay.
Where was that located?
Norfolk, Nebraska, or Norfolk, as they would say if you were in Virginia.
Just one perhaps an interesting comment to me is that the old soft disk games and utilities, they assumed that you only had a 2+. Everything was compatible with 2+. You mentioned no up and down arrows. Everything didn't use that. They didn't support the up and down arrows and use some other thing if they needed it.
Well, the IJKM diamond was popular because that's what you use for editing. Well, ABCD was what you used for editing before they supported the IJKM and the Apple II Plus. But
they insisted that everything be compatible with a 2+.
Yeah, I think at some point they might have, and you could be more right about this than I, but I wonder if by issue 166, when it was a little more mouse-driven, or they probably could use a joystick, but I wonder if they weren't making that so it was you had to have at least a 2E. But don't hold me to that. I haven't tried them.
Yeah, they might have eventually, but they went a long time.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Yes, sir.
To enhance your research, if I go through my stack of magazines, what ones are you interested in? What would be the top 2 or 3?
Oh, golly, I'd have to think about that because I'm in the point of trying to put this all into book form, which I hope to get a publisher for someday. I kind of work on stuff, and then I'm done with it. I set that aside, go on to the next thing. So I'm kind of past the magazine stuff right now. I think I've hit all the high points. I don't think there's other stuff that I need at the moment, but
At some point, my wife will say, it goes out, whether it goes to the landfill or someone who can use it, and I gotta make sure I get it to the right place.
well, you got if you go to my website, there's a contact on there, and if you find it's ever going to get to that kind of a point, talk to me, and we can see if it's something I feel I can take on. I have issues with storage at my house too, which is why I really like PDFs because they're easy to store.
Yeah.
But
It's labor intensive to convert from paper to PDF.
It is, yes.
We're out of time, so
Yes.
we're gonna have to move on.